The sun dipped behind the crooked rooftops of the French Quarter, smearing gold and crimson over the stained glass of St. Augustine's Cathedral. New Orleans, 1970, a city alive with jazz, bourbon, and secrets. On that June evening, the choir sang its last song before history silenced its most gifted voice. 55 years later in Baton Rouge, retired detective Raymond Dorsey sat at his kitchen table. The fan sputtered, stirring the heavy summer air. In front of him sat a cardboard box marked in faded red ink. St. Augustine, 06-1470, unsolved. His handwriting, his failure. Inside were photos, notes, recordings, remnants of the case that had chased him through every stage of his life. The victim, Emma Rousseau, 24, the cathedral's leading soprano, found dead behind the organ after evening mass. Her death had stunned the community, but faded quietly when the church's influence smothered the investigation. Raymond reached for the top photograph, Emma smiling, her eyes bright, unaware of what awaited her hours later. He flipped it over, revealing the next, the crime scene. Sheet music scattered across the marble floor, a broken rosary beside blood that had dried to black. No murder weapon, no witnesses, just silence, and one name that kept echoing in his memory: Samuel Dupont. The choir director, charismatic, admired, untouchable. Church leaders insisted he was innocent. The Archbishop himself had visited the precinct back then, offering guidance that sounded like orders. Dupont left town days later, never questioned again. The case went cold before Raymond could even finish his first year on the force. Now, decades later, the case was back in his hands, literally. 2 weeks earlier, someone had mailed him this forgotten box. No signature, just a note typed on plain paper. It's time you finish what they stopped. At the bottom lay a new piece of evidence, a cassette tape. The label read, "Choir Practice from June 1970. Curiosity beat caution. Raymond borrowed an old player from his neighbor and pressed play. At first came the hum of static, then Emma's voice, pure and delicate, a hymn suspended in time. But as her song ended, another voice entered, male, sharp with anger. "Emma, you can't walk away from this." Her tone was low. "I don't owe you anything anymore, Sam. Please, let's just stop." A thud, a muffled scream, silence. The tape clicked off. Raymond leaned back in his chair, breath caught. 55 years later, a real lead. Who had sent this? Was it proof or a cruel trick? By dawn, he had made a decision. He was going back to New Orleans, driving across the Pontchartrain Causeway. The skyline rose through the morning mist. The cathedral still stood, proud, aged, its bell tower looming over a city that pretends to forget. Tourists laughed outside, snapping photos. None of them would guess blood had once stained its marble floors. Inside, the choir was rehearsing. Different faces, same music. Their harmonies climbed toward the vaulted ceiling as Raymond stepped through the doorway. He watched quietly, noting the same organ, the same wooden pews, the same shadows. A voice startled him. "Sir, can I help you?" He turned. A woman in her 70s, elegant but guarded, approached. Her name tag read Margaret LeBlanc, choir president. "I'm just visiting," Raymond replied. "Used to be with the police." Recognition flickered in her eyes. "Detective Dorsey. You worked Emma's case." He nodded. "Trying to close some unfinished business." Her smile faded. "That case nearly tore this parish apart. Samuel Dupont was a good man in their eyes, but after the funeral, he left. Some said he never went far." She hesitated. "Father Henry was here too. If anyone knows what really happened, it's him, but—" She lowered her voice. "Be careful what you stir up. The past in this city doesn't stay buried quietly." Before he could speak again, someone called her name. When he looked back seconds later, she was gone, but on the pew beside him lay a small folded paper. Inside was an address, Chartres Street Rectory, 9 p.m. Beneath it, a warning. Trust no one from the choir. Rain started to fall as Raymond left the cathedral. Thunder rolled across the Mississippi, echoing through the narrow streets. He unfolded the note once more under the glow of a street lamp. Beneath the smudged words, he noticed something faintly stamped on the paper. A church seal. That night, from a dim motel room off Canal Street, he replayed the cassette. Emma's voice filled the room again. The last notes trembled like a confession cut short. Raymond stared at the tape recorder and whispered, "I hear you, Emma. I'm not walking away this time." Outside, lightning struck near the cathedral spire. New Orleans, a city built on secrets, was about to face one it never wanted uncovered. The rectory behind St. Augustine's Cathedral sat half hidden beneath the oaks, its red bricks wet and dark from the rain. Street lamps flickered along. The narrow path as Raymond approached, collar turned up against the damp wind. It was 9 o'clock sharp, the time written on the note folded inside his coat. Before he could knock, the door opened. A frail man in a black cassock stood in the frame, face drawn, eyes silver with fatigue. "Detective Dorsey," he said softly. "I hoped I wouldn't live to see this day." "Then why open the door, Father Henry?" Raymond asked. Henry motioned him inside. The house smelled of old wood and incense. Candles guttered along shelves crowded with framed photos, parish events, smiling choirs, Christmas services. Amid those images, Raymond spotted her, Emma Rousseau in her white choir robe, sunlight caught in her hair. Henri noticed the stare. "The closest thing this church ever had to grace," he murmured. "She believed in the music more than the men who ran it." Raymond set a cassette on the table. "You know what this is?" Henri's hand froze. He nodded slowly. "Samuel's confession. He brought it to me that night. I told him to destroy it." "But you kept a copy," Raymond said. "I disobeyed orders once," Henri replied, sitting heavily in a chair. "And I've regretted both obedience and betrayal ever since." He gestured for Raymond to sit. "Samuel and Emma were in love. You've guessed that much. But what no one wrote in your reports is why she died." Raymond leaned forward. "I'm listening." "She was about to expose something," Henri said. "The cathedral was laundering money, city contracts, charity funds, everything. Emma kept records. She planned to deliver them to a journalist the night she died. I warned her she didn't understand who she was provoking. She said truth was stronger than fear." Henri stopped, rubbing his temples. "Samuel begged her to leave town with him. They argued near the organ. It got violent. He came to me afterward drenched in guilt. But when I went to the church at dawn to call the police, her body was already gone. The archdiocese ordered silence." "So you covered a murder," Raymond said coldly. Henri met his eyes, unflinching. "I buried a soul. I told myself it was mercy. Now I know it was cowardice." He reached for a small brass key on a chain around his neck and set it on the table. "That unlocks the choir loft. The church sealed it in 1972. Samuel hid something there after he returned years later. Papers, maybe more proof. I didn't have the courage to look." Raymond pocketed the key. "Why tell me now?" Henri's hands shook. "Because death forgives many things, but silence is not one of them." The wind rattled the windows. Raymond rose and looked out toward the looming cathedral spire. "If you're lying, Father, I'll expose you along with them." Henri gave a weary nod. "Then maybe redemption has found me after all." Outside, the rain had slowed to mist. The cathedral loomed ahead like a sleeping giant as Raymond crossed the courtyard. He entered through the side door, footsteps echoing off the marble floor. The heavy stairs to the loft protested with every step. Dust filled the air, lit by the beam of his flashlight. Cobwebs curled across the wooden balustrade. He slid the old key into the lock. It turned with a stubborn click. The loft smelled of dust and wood polish. Faded hymnals lay in piles. At the far corner, something glimmered under debris. A small tin box. Raymond knelt, pried it open, and found yellowed pages covered in delicate handwriting. Emma's notes. Verses of songs, yes, but also numbers, ledgers, initials, proof. Beneath the papers was a photograph she'd taken, her arm around Samuel Dupont. Both smiling, their closeness undeniable. Raymond exhaled slowly. "So it was real," he whispered. A sound echoed from below, the footsteps entering through the front doors. He switched off his flashlight. The cathedral was dark, except for candlelight trembling from the altar. Someone moved through the main aisle, humming softly. The melody struck him cold. Ave Maria. He leaned over the railing. In the dim light, a tall man in a long coat stood at the altar, head bowed. The hair was grey now, but the face was unmistakable. The same from old photos, the one who vanished in 1970, Samuel Dupont. Alive. Raymond's chest tightened. He gripped the railing, watching as the man's humming stopped. Dupont lifted his head slowly, eyes finding the loft as if he'd known exactly where to look. His voice broke the silence. I knew you'd come back, Detective. She said you would. Lightning flashed through the stained glass, scattering color across the pews. Raymond's pulse quickened. The cold case wasn't just reopening, it had just walked back into the light. Rain hammered against the stained glass windows as Raymond descended from the choir loft. Below, in the shimmer of candlelight, stood a man who should have been long dead. Samuel Dupont, thinner, greyer, his posture bent but his eyes burning with a strange calm. The silence between them carried 55 years of unanswered questions. You finally came back, Raymond said, voice low. Dupont turned, the corners of his mouth tightening. I never really left, Detective. Some sins echo too loud to hide from. Thunder rolled overhead, shaking the cathedral's rafters. Raymond stepped into the glow of the altar. You disappeared after Emma died. Everyone thought you were guilty. Why show up now? Dupont's laugh was short and dry. Because truth has an expiration date and mine is close. Father Henry's dying, isn't he? He couldn't keep his promise forever. He told me parts, Raymond said. You argued with Emma that night. Dupont lowered his eyes. She found something she wasn't meant to see. Records hidden in the rectory's archives. Money that flowed through this church from powerful men who prayed louder than they lived clean. She wanted to go public. I tried to protect her, but I was a coward. Raymond stepped closer. Protect her from what? From Lemoyne, Dupont answered. Monsignor Baptiste Lemoyne, the Archbishop's shadow. He controlled everything. The choir funds, the parish schools, even the police reports. Emma had proof he was laundering money through the cathedral. I begged her to stay quiet. She said truth mattered more than Judgment Day. He paused, his voice breaking. We fought, she fell. I thought she was dead. You ran. I confessed to Henry. The church told me to leave town and forget. But I couldn't. You don't forget someone like her. Raymond studied him carefully. You're saying the church covered up her murder? I'm saying, Dupont murmured, they finished what I started. For a long moment nothing moved but the flickering candles. Then Dupont reached slowly into his coat and pulled out an envelope, its edges cracked with mold and time. He handed it over. Inside was a photo, Emma sitting beside a man in clerical robes. On the back, written in delicate ink, for Henri, tell him he was right. Raymond frowned. Who's this? Dupont's answer came like a curse. Lemoyne. Before Raymond could speak again, a sound echoed from the church entrance, 2 sets of footsteps, steady and deliberate. The front doors creaked, and figures stepped into the nave. Dark suits, cold expressions. Men who didn't need badges to be dangerous. Dupont's face drained of color. They followed me here. One of the men called out, Mr. Dupont, please join us. Monsignor Lemoyne wishes to remind you of your vow of silence. Raymond's hand slid toward his revolver. Not tonight. The taller man smiled faintly. Detective Dorsey, this isn't your war. Walk away, Dupont whispered. You can't stop them. But you can outlive them. He shoved something small and wax-sealed toward Raymond, a folded parchment. This is what she died for. Samuel, wait, Raymond started, but the first gunshot thundered through the cathedral. Dupont staggered, the impact echoing like a drumbeat beneath the vaulted roof. A second shot followed. Raymond dove behind a pew as glass shattered overhead. The shooters turned, retreating through the heavy doors before he could return fire. He rushed to the altar. Dupont lay on his side, blood spreading across the marble tiles near Emma's name carved into the choir memorial. Raymond knelt beside him. She didn't fall, Dupont rasped. They silenced her. Henry helped bury her beneath the confessional. Raymond gripped his shoulder. Stay with me. Give me names. Dupont shook his head weakly. Find what's under the chapel floor. She's still waiting. His eyes fixed upward, lips parted as if finishing a prayer that never came. Raymond stayed kneeling for a long time, the thunder outside moving farther downriver. He looked at the parchment in his hand, Thick paper, church seal cracked open by age. He broke it carefully. Inside were notes in Emma's handwriting, ledgers, dates, a list of names that stretched far beyond the choir. Politicians, bankers, clergy, a map of rot disguised as faith. He folded it and tucked it inside his jacket. Dupont's final words circled in his head. Under the chapel floor. Raymond stood slowly, glancing one last time at the lifeless body. "I'll find her," he murmured. Outside, the rain softened into mist. Neon lights from Bourbon Street spilled faint color onto the cathedral doors as he stepped back into the street. The city looked the same as it had in 1970, alive, beautiful, and utterly unrepentant. Raymond walked away without looking back, the folded parchment burning against his chest. Emma Rousseau's voice was gone, but her truth had finally found someone stubborn enough to carry it. Dawn crept over New Orleans like a secret too heavy to tell. The rain had stopped, leaving streets slick and shining under the pale sky. Raymond parked a block from St. Augustine's Cathedral, watching its spire cut through the mist. Somewhere in that building, 55 years of silence waited to fracture. Inside, the police had come and gone. The archdiocese had already reclaimed Dupont's body before sunrise, packaging it as an act of mercy. The press called it a tragic end to an aging recluse. No mention of murder. No mention of truth. Raymond stood before the confessional where Dupont had pointed before dying. Beneath its panels, the floor looked disturbed, faint lines tracing a hidden space. He unfolded Emma Rousseau's parchment once again. Her note was simple. He moves truth beneath his altar. The church had sealed everything, literally and spiritually, but Raymond had no interest in asking permission. He found a pry bar from the maintenance closet, wedged it under the marble, and pushed until the first corner cracked loose. A rush of stale air rose up, carrying decades of decay. Beneath the slab, a narrow staircase spiraled downward into darkness. The beam of his flashlight sliced through dust as he descended. The passage opened into a small stone chamber. Wooden crosses lined the walls. At the center sat a coffin, newer than everything around it. The lid bore no name. Raymond's pulse quickened. He lifted the lid slowly. No body. Only a folded cloak, a rosary, and a sealed envelope resting where a chest should have been. The paper crackled as he opened it. Inside were documents, property deeds, letters, and bank ledgers, all bearing the signature of P. Monseigneur Baptiste Lemoine. Large sums of money flowed from state contracts into charity accounts that disappeared offshore. On one page, written in Emma's delicate handwriting, he read, "He meets them below the altar." His breath caught. This was what she'd died for. This was what the church had buried. Evidence of corruption decades deep. From above came the creak of wood. Someone was there. Raymond turned off the flashlight, waited, and listened. The sound of shoes descended the stairs, slow and measured. "Detective," a voice called softly, "I was hoping you'd find it." Monseigneur Lemoine. His tone was smooth, nearly kind. He stepped into the faint light, his cassock immaculate, his gold cross gleaming. "The cathedral has a way of drawing the faithful back," he said. "Even those who've lost their faith." "Faith didn't kill Emma," Raymond said. "You did," Lemoine smiled faintly. "Careful. The truth you think you've found isn't as clean as you hope. She wasn't innocent, detective. She threatened to destroy more than men. She threatened the institution that gives them purpose. She wanted to expose you. She wanted power," he replied calmly. "She found it for a moment and lost it here. You call it murder. I call it divine balance." Raymond tightened his jaw. "You buried her beneath this church." Lemoine's eyes hardened. She was laid closer to God than she ever hoped to be. The weight of his words ignited something in Raymond. "You lied to the city for 55 years. Truth is a tool," the Monsignor said. "And you, detective, were always meant to stay asleep." He reached into his cassock and a flash of metal. Raymond dove for cover as the gun fired. The bullet clanged off stone. He swung the crowbar up from his belt and rushed forward. Lemoine struck first, grazing his shoulder, but age had dulled his precision. Raymond slammed the bar into his wrist. The pistol clattered to the ground. They grappled in the dim chamber, breath echoing off the dead walls. Lemoine drove his knee into Raymond's ribs. Pain exploded through him. "You think killing me will change anything?" The priest hissed. "I'm a pillar. Break me and the church builds 10 more." Raymond answered with another strike. knocking Lemoyne back into the coffin. The old man gasped, clutching his chest. The gold cross broke from its chain, skittering across the stone floor. "You built your church on graves," Raymond said, voice shaking. Lemoyne's face drained of color. "You can't win against faith." "I'm not fighting faith," Raymond said. "I'm fighting liars." With one final blow, he sent the crowbar into the coffin's edge. The structure splintered. Lemoyne slumped inside, breath fading to silence. Raymond stood panting, the echoes slowly dying around him. The documents still rested on the stone beside the coffin. He gathered them, sliding them into his coat. Emma's handwriting peeked from the top page. "If truth is buried, dig until it sings." He climbed back up the stairs, light growing with each step. The first glow of sunrise broke through the cathedral windows, painting the pews gold. Outside, the bells began to toll. The city would soon wake, unaware that its most sacred walls had just cracked open. Raymond stepped into the street, damp air brushing against his face. He looked once at the towering cathedral spire. The bells kept ringing, but this time they did not sound holy. They sounded human, imperfect, heavy, and real. He walked away slowly, the envelope pressed to his chest, ready to let the world finally hear Emma Rousseau's song. By noon, whispers spread through the city like smoke. A rumor of discovery. A detective digging where God had forbidden men to look. The church dismissed it as gossip, but in New Orleans, secrets don't stay buried long. Raymond sat in a small diner on Basin Street, rain streaking the windows beside him. The papers he'd taken from the crypt lay across the table, edges still damp. The handwriting on them was unmistakable. Emma Rousseau's. She had kept lists, donor names, transaction amounts, and one signature repeated over and over again: Monseigneur Baptiste Lemoyne. But another scribble caught his attention now, faint but legible at the bottom corner of one page. Archbishop Fontaine approved the fund transfers. Raymond leaned back, heart steady but cold. The same man buried as a saintly reformer was part of her death. He glanced at the reflection in the diner mirror, a man too old to start wars and too stubborn to retire from one. Across the room, the waitress refilled his coffee without a word. People knew who he was now. The man who broke into the cathedral, the man poking at ghosts. If he stopped, the truth would vanish again. If he kept going, someone else might not let him finish. By 6, the rain softened, and the streets shimmered orange beneath the streetlights. Raymond drove toward the river, following the wide boulevard that led to the Archdiocese building. He parked behind the gated fence, coat pulled tight against the wind. The service door opened easily under pressure from his crowbar. Inside smelled of paper and polish. Portraits of saints and bishops watched from the walls, a lineup of men who'd been worshipped before being forgotten. At the end of the corridor stood the archive room, behind a frosted glass door. Raymond slipped inside. Rows of filing cabinets stretched forward like pews. Labels ran along each drawer. Donor records, choir membership, financial holdings. He opened one marked 1970-1972 contracts and froze. The same handwriting as before. Fontaine's ledger after ledger linked shell charities to private accounts. Among the names listed were donors, police officers, bankers, and the city's mayor at the time. At the bottom of a ledger page, next to Emma's own notes, was another message. He meets them below the confessional Baptiste Fontaine night of June 14th, the exact night she was killed. Raymond shoved the files into a folder. Then the door creaked. A young man in a black coat stood there, pale, mid-30s. His badge reading Archdiocese Security. He didn't raise a weapon. Only studied Raymond silently. "I'm not here to stop you," the guard said. "But if you value your life, burn what you've seen and walk away." "I've ignored the truth too long," Raymond replied. "Can't do it again." The guard hesitated, lowering his gaze. "Then you should see what's upstairs. Second floor, west wing. It's what she saw before she died." Raymond nodded once and slipped past him. He climbed the narrow staircase, every creak echoing like accusation. At the end of a corridor, he found an old wooden door locked with a single chain. He forced it open. Dust rolled out like smoke. Inside were boxes stacked against the wall. On one of them, faded marker read "Choir Practice, June 1970. He opened it carefully. Inside lay contact sheets from an old camera reel. Photos of that evening. Most showed the choir mid-song, but one frame froze him in place. Emma near the organ speaking with Lemoine. Another man stood behind them, mostly obscured by shadow. Archbishop Fontaine. Raymond studied the expressions. Emma looked tense. Lemoine's hand gripped her arm. And Fontaine's face, cold, turned slightly toward the camera, as if he'd noticed her being photographed. She must have hidden the film before that night ended. He gathered the negatives and slid them into his coat with the ledgers. That was the proof. Proof too big for any priest to bury. Outside, thunder cracked again. The first rain of evening swept across the street as he left the building, heading straight to his car. He sealed the papers, negatives, and Emma's letters into one envelope. On the front, he wrote the name of a journalist he trusted, someone who'd once fought City Hall and survived. He dropped the envelope in a metal mailbox near the curb. The clang of the closing flap echoed like final absolution. Back in his car, he sat for a moment staring at the faint golden glow of St. Augustine's far across the fog. For the first time since reopening the case, he felt something shift. Not relief exactly, but release. The bells of the cathedral began to ring in the distance. Through the noise of the storm, a faint melody drifted with them, soft, trembling, unmistakable. Ave Maria. Raymond closed his eyes. Maybe wind carried the sound, or maybe after 55 years, Emma Rousseau's voice had finally been freed. When morning finally came, the first headline on the paper read, "Her name was Emma Rousseau, the woman who sang truth into light." Raymond carried the paper to the porch. The city was starting to calm. The cathedral reopened for prayer only, stripped of ornament and procession. People said the new archbishop promised transparency. Raymond didn't believe in promises anymore, but he did believe in beginnings. He walked to the riverfront as the sun broke through the clouds. The breeze lifted the smell of wet magnolia and brick. For the first time in months, he felt something close to peace. He took Emma's leather journal from his coat and placed it gently into the current. The river carried it away without resistance, pages fanning open before sinking under the gleam of sunlight. "Farewell, songbird," he whispered. "Ios home." As the waves carried the journal downstream, the bells of St. Augustine struck 9, slow, sonorous, alive. The sound rolled through the quarter, blending with the hum of the waking city. In that moment, Raymond Dorsey knew the case had never been just about solving a murder. It had been about freeing a voice. And though her story was done, its echo would linger. Not just in headlines or records, but in every soul brave enough to speak when silence demanded otherwise. Weeks passed. The uproar began to fade, replaced by quieter ripples of consequence. The city kept moving, always forward, never forgetting but rarely looking back for long. Yet within the oldest corners of New Orleans, that story still breathed. St. Augustine's Cathedral reopened with modest ceremony. No media crews, no speeches. Repairs had been made to the damaged floor near the confessional, but no plaque or sign marked what had been uncovered there. Only a single candle now burned beside the altar, lit every morning by the same hand. Father Henri's assistant, a woman everyone recognized but few approached. The parish called it Emma's Light. Raymond returned one Sunday morning as the bells rang across the quarter. He didn't sit near the front this time. He stood in the back, shadowed beneath the balcony. The choir began to sing, voices unfamiliar yet strangely comforting. The hymn wasn't Ave Maria, but for a heartbeat, he could have sworn he heard her tone threaded through the harmony. Light. Pure absolute. Henry spotted him from across the nave and raised a faint hand. The priest's health was failing quickly, but his eyes held peace. After the service, they met on the cathedral steps, the air thick with the smell of rain and incense. "She would have liked this morning," Henri said. Raymond nodded. "She'd have liked knowing people remembered her." "They do," Henri replied. "Even when they don't know it's her." They sat in silence. A child from the parish ran by, chasing pigeons. The bells tolled again before quiet returned. Henry exhaled softly. "I've requested transfer to a retreat up north. My time here's done." "You deserve rest," Raymond said. Henry's gaze dropped. "None of us truly deserve it, but sometimes grace shows up anyway." He handed Raymond a sealed envelope. "The diocese is returning Emma's personal effects. These belong with someone who understands." Inside, Raymond later found a worn silver locket with a tiny photo of a young Emma and Samuel Dupont. The clasp had been repaired recently. Beneath it lay a folded note written in Henri's shaky hand, for those who loved her enough to listen. That evening, Raymond walked through the French Quarter as jazz drifted from the open doors of a bar. The sound mixed with laughter, voices, and the heartbeat rhythm that never left the city. He passed groups of tourists who'd heard only the version of the story told by headlines: the priest, the detective, the scandal. But that wasn't the story he carried. His was smaller, quieter, a woman's song that refused to fade, and how its echo changed the living. He reached Jackson Square just as the sun began to set, bathing the spires of St. Louis Cathedral in brilliant gold. He paused at a street musician's corner, a young singer performing with her band. Her voice, rough but angelic, rose through the noise. For a moment the crowd hushed, and in that fragile stillness he heard something familiar. When the song ended, Raymond stepped forward and pressed the small silver locket into the singer's palm. "Keep that safe," he said. "It belonged to someone who believed music could tell the truth." She smiled uncertainly, then hung the locket around her neck. As she strummed her next song, the light caught it, sending a flicker across the square like a heartbeat reborn. Raymond moved on, past the riverfront where barges rumbled like distant thunder. The sky turned to violet. He found his way to the edge of the levee, where the Mississippi stretched wide and endless. The city behind him hummed with life. The river ahead whispered of endings and beginnings. He leaned against the railing, taking a long breath. The ache of years pressed against his chest, but he understood something now. Closure wasn't about answers. It was about acceptance. In the dying light he imagined Emma again, not in the cathedral, not as a ghost, but young, standing in the choir loft, sunlight on her face. Singing not Ave Maria, but something new, something freer. He smiled, speaking quietly to the wind. "You finished your song, Emma. You just needed someone to listen." The bells of St. Augustine's sounded once more, their notes carrying far over the rooftops and into the slow breath of the river. With each toll, the noise of the city softened, as if bowing to that final echo, a melody neither holy nor tragic, just human. Raymond turned from the water and started back through the quarter, his step steady, his pocket empty for the first time in years. Behind him the bells faded, and jazz took over again. Laughter, brass, the rhythm of a city at peace with its chaos. Under that sound, another voice lingered, faint but sure, woven into every song that rose from the streets. The voice that had once been silenced now belonged to everyone who dared to sing the truth. And for Raymond Dorsey, that was enough. The story broke 3 days later. It started as a small headline in the Times-Picayune. Documents suggest embezzlement in 1970s New Orleans church. Within hours, other outlets picked it up. By dusk, television anchors were standing outside St. Augustine's Cathedral, their voices bouncing against the old stone like accusations. The Archdiocese issued a formal statement, denying everything. Raymond knew that was only the beginning. From his modest house outside Baton Rouge, he watched the coverage unfold in silence. The photos Emma had hidden, the ledgers he'd mailed, the evidence DuPont had died protecting, all of it had gone public. And yet, amid the noise, no one spoke her name. They called it the St. Augustine Files, not the Emma Rousseau case. He turned off the television and stared at the rain sliding down his window. The quiet hurt more than the decades of doubt. Truth had surfaced, but justice still felt out of reach. That night he drove back to New Orleans. The city glowed faint under the storm clouds, neon bleeding from the bars into the wet streets. St. Augustine's tower loomed against the flashes of lightning, both majestic and monstrous. He parked a block away and walked through the narrow alley to the cathedral's side door. It was unlocked. The police had left after the investigation, but the church had not re-blessed the ground. Inside, candles still burned where parishioners tried to pray the scandal away. Raymond stepped quietly toward the altar, past the confessional that now stood roped off. He stopped at the first pew. The air smelled of wax and dust, just as it had the night he reopened the case. From his pocket, he pulled a small tape recorder, the cassette DuPont had given him. He pressed play. Emma's voice filled the cathedral one last time. Clear, pure, not haunted, human. When the recording ended, Raymond set the tape on the marble rail and whispered, "You can rest now." As he turned to leave, soft footsteps echoed behind him. A man approached from the shadows of the choir loft. Father Henri. His once steady hands now trembled against his cane. Detective, Henri said quietly. You did what I couldn't. You told me the truth, Raymond replied. That's more than most. Henri's eyes moved toward the altar. I kept my silence because I believed the church could redeem itself. But it can't heal with lies in its walls. I wrote to the district attorney this morning. I told them everything. Raymond's chest tightened. That'll ruin you. The priest smiled faintly. Better my ruin than her memories. Lightning flashed again, lighting the stained glass where Emma's likeness stood, frozen in song above the choir loft. Henri turned his gaze there. She wanted her truth to live in the open air. And now it does. He reached into his coat and handed Raymond a small leather-bound book. She gave me this days before she died. I was too afraid to read it then. Raymond opened it carefully. Inside were handwritten reflections, journal entries from Emma. The final page stopped him cold. June 13th, 1970. If anything happens to me, tell them I was not afraid. The church cannot bury a voice. It only teaches it to echo. He closed the book. You think they'll actually prosecute? Henri's answer was soft. They might. Or they'll delay, distract, and eventually rebuild the walls. But now the cracks are visible. And cracks, detective, let the light in. When Raymond left the church, dawn was creeping across the skyline. Reporters stood by the gates, their cameras flashing between raindrops. He walked past them unnoticed, the small leather book tucked inside his jacket. At the edge of the French Quarter, he stopped to watch the morning unfold. The bells rang again, this time deliberate, slower than before, each toll carrying across the river. He thought of Emma, Dupont, Henri, and every soul who had been silenced for telling the truth. For the first time since reopening the case, he felt peace replace anger. Some stories didn't end with arrest or redemption. Some ended simply by being told. He started his car but didn't drive off right away. Instead, he looked back toward the towering cathedral. Sunlight began piercing through the clouds, catching the glass in a blaze of color. Reds, blues, and gold flooded across the wet pavement, the colors of forgiveness and failure intertwined. As a final gust of wind swept through the streets, the faint recording of Emma's Ave Maria still echoed in his head. Not as grief this time, but as freedom, a song that refused to die. Raymond smiled faintly, started the engine, and drove away as New Orleans woke to a new day, one where the past had finally learned how to speak. A week later, the city still hadn't settled. Protesters filled the courtyard outside St. Augustine's Cathedral, holding candles and placards that read, "Let her be heard and justice for Emma." The archdiocese had closed the building temporarily for safety, but everyone knew what that meant. Containment. Raymond wandered among the crowd unnoticed. He wore his same old coat, its pockets heavy with the journal Henri had given him. He watched the faces, old parishioners confused and wounded, young ones angry and loud. They weren't marching only for Emma Rousseau. They were marching for the years they'd spent believing the wrong people. A reporter approached him, microphone in hand. "Detective Dorsey?" "You broke the story, didn't you? Tell us, what really happened in that church basement?" Raymond shook his head. "You already know what matters," she pressed. "Did you kill Monsignor Lemoine?" His eyes hardened. Evil kills itself when truth finally stands up. The crowd around them chanted Emma's name. People poured flowers against the iron gates, magnolias, white lilies, even sheet music torn and folded into petals. Raymond stepped closer to the gate and placed Emma's tape recorder among the flowers. Someone had scratched her initials into its casing. E.R. He turned and saw Father Henri across the street, supported by two younger priests. His health had worsened. His voice barely carried, but he gave a small nod when their eyes met. Neither needed to speak. By sunset, the protests turned into a vigil, the air filled with candlelight and slow hymns echoing against brick walls. Raymond stood back from the group, the weight of fatigue settling deep in his shoulders. For so long, the case had been his only reason to stay awake at night. Now that it was done, he didn't know how to rest. A woman's voice nearby startled him from thought. "You knew her, didn't you?" He turned. A middle-aged woman held a candle, rain glinting in her hair. "I sang beside Emma when I was 17, she said softly. "She used to say that truth is like music. It doesn't care who listens so long as somebody does. Raymond exhaled. She was right. The woman smiled faintly. Then keep listening. She placed her candle at his feet and disappeared into the crowd. Later, as the vigil faded, Raymond drove through the French Quarter. The city glowed beneath heavy clouds, alive as always, soulful, stubborn, unbreakable. But something had shifted in its rhythm. Outside St. Augustine's, reporters snapped photos. Inside the courthouse across town, officials announced formal charges against surviving members of the church's old financial board. The story wasn't ending. It was multiplying. Back home, he spread Emma's journal across his desk. The last page was dated June 14th, 1970, the day she died. If you find these notes, please don't pity me. Stories stop when fear wins. Promise me you'll finish the song. He read it twice before closing the book. His phone rang, a familiar voice from the newsroom. We're naming her tomorrow, the journalist said. Front page. A full story. Not just the scandal, her life. Raymond's throat tightened. Make sure they spell her name right. That night he couldn't sleep. The rain returned, steady and rhythmic, tapping against the window like a metronome. In the distance, faintly under the thunder, church bells tolled again. He half expected to hear Ave Maria drift from somewhere in the darkness. He rose, went to his record player, and lowered the needle. Music filled the room, not Emma's voice, but a piano recording she'd once made for the choir. The melody carried warmth, not sorrow. He closed his eyes and listened. For years, these cases were forgotten. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever. Here we reopen the files, reveal the evidence, and give a voice to those who were silenced. Subscribe now and step inside the archive where time, lies, and justice finally meet. Because every secret eventually speaks.